Now that is the sound of quality. Power cable is a disaster. There's so much space between the cable itself and the connector that you would need a taxi to drive that distance if you had to get from one side to the other. All right, next problem is the fact that the video card's not slotted. Okay, GPU comes out, which is easy because they didn't install it properly anyway. This is a plastic backplate. For the first time in a year, we're revisiting Cyberpower's pre-built computers to see if they got it together. The answer is no. Thanks for watching. See you next time. The system arrived with a damaged and non-functional SSD, an unseated GPU, and a loose GPU power cable. The misconfigured liquid cooler pump sounds grotesque. Last year around this time, we said this about the Cyberpower system that we reviewed then. In 6 months, we are going to look at the options again. And we're gonna try again to find a good one, just like we did here. Well, we more than doubled the time that we said we'd give them to see if they'd fix the issues. And to their credit, they have fixed one of them and have introduced many more new ones. In typical Cyberpower fashion, the CPU was limited on thermal headroom and unable to achieve its advertised boost clocks, despite technically improving upon the Cyberpower system we reviewed last year at the cost of the system noise level. Cyberpower promised us love at first boot, so add it to the list of under-delivered promises. Because it did not do that. The computer doesn't boot. It didn't turn on when we got it, so not a good start. But it's got kind of a fun backstory because Ryan on the team who handles a lot of the sort of the advertising stuff, he messaged me and he said, is there any pre-built brand you can recommend? I don't have a lot of time. I got to get a system in for something quick. Is there anyone who's okay? And I said, no. But with Cyberpower and IO Power, at least, it's going to be pretty close to DIY cost, and then you can fix whatever they fuck up, and then it'll be an okay computer. So he went with this. Ryan, I'm sorry. And he said it doesn't turn on. I then bought the computer from him, both because it would be an interesting review and because I felt bad. And this, he's right. It came out of the box and had a bunch of problems. We're going to look at it today. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the Frozen A720 cooler. The A720 air cooler performed well in our testing last year. The A720 is a relatively high-end, dual 140mm air cooler with 7 heat pipes. We found the use of larger fans can be beneficial to acoustic performance given the thermals, although you'll want to check your case for compatibility given the taller nature of the cooler and its fans. ID Cooling uses an all-black look for its A720 and includes mounting hardware for all modern sockets. Learn more at the link in the description below. My favorite part, though, is that someone on the Gamers Nexus team who needed a pre-built computer for personal use got the fucked up computer. Because it's just like, I meant to move this before we started filming. Because it's like, could you have shipped it to a worse customer than someone who would just straight pipeline it to us for the review? But anyway, at the time we checked prices just before the further SSD price hike, Cyberpower was selling the strongly paired 9800 X3D and RTX 5080 system for $3,260, which is only $100 greater than the build's DIY price, as collected on the same date as the system price. Just note that the prices are changing nearly daily right now due to DRAM and SSD pricing, but we compared these on the same day and that's what matters. But ultimately they were $100 over DIY parts cost, which is a pretty good start. It's just unfortunate all the other problems. If the SSD weren't DOA and the GPU were seated and the power cable were plugged in properly, especially because it's 12 volt high power, then this might have received our coveted It's Better Than Dell award for the $3,300 system. This is the Cyberpower PC GML, hang on, 99653. It makes more sense for them than most other people because, frankly, when you offer as many configurations as Cyberpower, you probably do need to make use of all 5 digits there. The GML 99653 that we ordered is technically out of stock right now, but Cyberpower still sells a like-for-like system configuration for $3,260. That's if you customize it with the Gaming PC Master 9500 listing. The product listing states, quote, maximize your potential and break new boundaries with the latest products offered by Intel and NVIDIA, expertly handpicked, assembled, and tested by Cyberpower PC, backed with our extensive PC building experience, end quote. Now, the system doesn't have an Intel CPU, and it also slipped through testing, so 0 for 2 on that sentence. Cyberpower did break some boundaries though, namely disfiguring this SSD screw hole. Cyberpower also offers what it calls a rush service, which simply reads, rush! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, ready to ship in next business day, end quote. Honestly, the last thing they need to be doing is rushing builds given what came out with this one, but we've got some numbers for you as well, and a pricing breakdown. So let's look at that first. We collected these prices leading into March. They've moved a bit since then, but what we care about is how close Cyberpower is to reality, not how much it's changing right now. Compared to the GML 99653's like-for-like configuration sold by Cyberpower, the pre-built price is only $100 greater than the price of buying the components individually and building the system yourself at the time we collected the prices, amounting to a roughly 3% increase over DIY. That gap is impressive in a good way. And maybe why system integrators have fared a little bit better, until now anyway, than some of the DIY part sellers. Historically, Cyberpower has maintained the $100 to $400 range premium over DIY, and it usually tries to compete based on value, which we appreciate. It'd be better if the system worked, but you know, we'll get there when we get there. Obviously, you could go cheaper with DIY by substituting certain components, but we try to use like-for-like components wherever possible to make it a fairer comparison. The spec sheet mostly makes sense and is all non-proprietary, which is great. We view that as a necessity. The system comes with a 9800X3D and an RTX 5080. There's a 360mm liquid cooler, a B850 Wi-Fi motherboard, 1000 watt non-modular power supply, so they're saving some pennies there, a 2TB NVMe SSD that may or may not work upon arrival, and 32GB of DDR5 6000 RAM, albeit with awful CL48 timings. The 9800X3D will be doing some heavy lifting to make up for the RAM there, but fortunately that is something the X3D CPUs actually are good at. Cyberpower configures the components in what it calls the Cyberpower PC Montech HSO1 Curve 360V, but what Montech calls the HSO2. Our understanding is that before Montech released its HSO1 and HSO2 cases, which differ by way of front mesh versus glass panels, Cyberpower exclusively sold the HSO2 and certain pre-builts as the HSO1 Curve 360V. Then Montech launched the case as the HSO2, but Cyberpower never updated it. We have a separate review of the Montech cases if you're interested in that. Amusingly, upon Ryan on the team ordering the PC, Cyberpower's survey process asked, "Where did you hear about Cyberpower PC?" And oddly, they listed Gamer Nexus, which they spelled wrong as one of the possible responses. Just to be clear, 1, there's an S, but 2, we're not currently advertising Cyberpower systems, and we don't have any affiliate links with them. This certainly makes it seem like we do, but maybe they're referring to our reviews. Thankfully, it's unlikely we'll have to worry about Cyberpower tailoring review samples in the future, considering that, contrary to our typical anonymous as possible approach when ordering pre-builts, Ryan used his GN email address and the PC we received was still DOA. He was trying to just get something that worked, but it didn't. But after the system wouldn't boot and he noticed the unseated GPU and loose cabling, he immediately repackaged the system as it arrived, and we took it over for review. We inspected the drive under our microscope first, and immediately noticed damage around the SSD screw hole. We also probed the SSD's contact pins on the opposite end, but ultimately we weren't able to detect any shorts to ground. Cyberpower, like all system integrators we know of, has mandatory testing processes that all systems have to pass before shipping. We've been to the factory line in California. We don't know if this system slipped through the cracks and was sent out despite failing testing, which we think is unlikely, or if the SSD was somehow damaged in shipping despite there being no signs of shipping damage anywhere in the system, which we find even less likely than that. There's just no realistic way for the SSD to incur shipping damage in this situation without something else also breaking, and the box doesn't show any signs of shipping issues. The SSD is like under a heatsink on the motherboard. It's not shipping. We don't know what happened, but it's something that Cyberpower surely should have caught. Okay, enough of that. So now we're going to get into the teardown of this. All right, panels came off no problem, so now we're going to look inside and see what we need to do to make this bootable to actually review it. All right, so first thing we're going to do is get this GPU out where, first of all, the power cable is a disaster. There's so much space between the cable itself and the connector that you would need a taxi to drive that distance if you had to get from one side to the other. That is actually dangerous on these cards. Now, fortunately, a 5080 is not as much power as a 5090 or something, but I mean, that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't have a power cable that's barely even plugged in, especially when it's 12 volt high power. But let's rescue the GPU here. All right, next problem is the fact that the video card's not slotted. So this PCIe slot, this isn't actually even popped up. which means, I mean, now it's seated. I seated it. So they shipped it without it actually being fully socketed, which means the pins are partially sticking out of the PCIe slot. And that's not good either. We gotta rescue it from the back here. Hang on. Okay, GPU comes out, which is easy because they didn't install it properly anyway. All right, so there's nothing special about this. This is just an MSI video card. A lot of plastic, actually. There's something, I take it back. There's something special about this. It's this. This is a plastic backplate. Look, I know MSI technically made this part. This could be something that would actually sink heat. And although, yes, not a lot of heat comes out of the back of the video card, we're gonna go a step further than we normally do for teardowns. And I'm gonna remove the backplate to make a point, which is, I'm really curious to see. Look at that, look at that. Now that is the sound of quality. I'm really tempted to crack this in half right now. This makes things worse. This is an insulator. I know MSI made the card, but Cyberpower chose it. And I guess this is where you get your $100 increase over MSRP, unfortunately. But this would actually be better without a backplate. We've done this testing. It's been a little while, but we've published content in the past showing that with a plastic backplate versus no backplate at all, you are actually worse off. And that's because not only does this not provide any structural integrity whatsoever, it also traps the heat against the back of the card. At least they weren't so delusional, though, as to put thermal pads on this. That would have been really embarrassing. All right, we're gonna get Flappy the backplate out of the way. Move back to the computer itself. All right, so first of all, in terms of cables and fan stuff, we've got 8 fans in here. There's 3 top as exhaust, 3 bottom as intake. This is just a Montec case, 2 in the back. We've reviewed this case. You want to know about that. That's not really Cyberpower's part here. And then cables, we've got fully seated. EPS 12 volt, that's good. This is also fully seated, yep. So they've done that properly. Unfortunately, they're using a daisy chain connector now. On EPS 12 volt, 8 pins, you've got the headroom for this. This isn't gonna like cause a fire or something. It's just not the best practice. We've got a doubled up fan connector on the top, fully seated pump connector, unfortunately, because it's making all the noise. Speaking of that, let's get the pump out of here. Is it fully seated? Yes. All right, that's good. So the screws were completely tightened and torqued. They've done that without issue. Okay, cooler is free. Let's take a look at, well, that's, they didn't tighten that enough. This is not this screw should still be in the back plate. So that was not tight enough because it came up with the rest. But not the worst thing we've seen. It just means it might have been a little off on one side. In terms of paste application, looks like this was silk screened on there. So this did not need to be applied by someone at Cyberpower. It looks good overall, but interestingly, you can see a little bit less of an impression on this corner. They're slightly off, so this is maybe more of a cooler thing than necessarily a torque thing, considering we're offset on a side I wouldn't expect. But here, you can see that the impression of the thermal paste indicates the reduced pressure on this side, especially because that leg of the IHS was not fully contacting the paste. That's not going to impact those. It's just because of the way they configured the rest of the computer. So CPU. This part, we know there's no issues with the pins or anything. So the CPU has no paste down here in the corner, which aligns with what we just saw on the CPU cooler, where it's just lacking on one corner. So no contact there. Again, not going to be the reason they failed the thermals. That's not going to save them here. Okay, other cables. So 24 pin, fully seated, no issues. USB 3, no issues, no bent pins, that's good. No issues on the front header. The RAM is in the slots that are appropriate for the RAM. Let's make sure there's no funny business here. So that is the stick they're advertising. That is the C48 awful timings, DDR5 6000 memory. I'm just gonna put the CPU back in the socket here to protect it while I work on the rest. All right, as for everything else, I mean, HD audio is in properly, no issues. Front panel, no issues. So the rest of this is all fine. Let's take a look at the cable management. No issues with the cables other than the 12 volt high power. So they were all seated properly. Screws, no issues with the torque or tightness on those. Looking at the back here, cable management's clean. They've done that well, but Cyberpower has never had an issue with cable management as far as I can remember anyway. So this is looking good. They've got it all zip tied together. They've taped the RGB cables so that they don't come apart from each other in shipping. Maybe they should tape the 12 volt high power cable into the video card. There's an idea for you, Cyberpower. Just a big piece of electrical tape. Make sure it's fire resistant, and that should solve that problem. But yeah, cable management looks good. So, I mean, the build overall, it's kind of what we expected, which is there's just a few really key problems. And that SSD, let me pull that out, actually. We'll do that now. So during our troubleshooting for this, the SSD, we did try this in other slots also. And we tried it even in other motherboards in our office. And it's not going to work. So it wasn't where they put it. The biggest visual thing is going to be the screw holes. Or the screw hole, which is kind of scratched. I wouldn't suspect that would kill it. Maybe they torqued it so much and then they loosened it and it came back to shape and then it was, it looked fine, but it was already destroyed or something. I don't know. The drive, we already know the SSD doesn't work. So that's unfortunately just e-waste. There's no life signs at all for it. But that's going to be it for the teardown. Let's get into some more of the numbers. We'll start with CPU thermals at steady state under full system load, as that's been a weak point for Cyberpower historically. The last few reviews we've done of Cyberpower systems, we've said that you should only buy their system if you're comfortable immediately changing the CPU cooler. Under a full system torture workload, CPU T-die spikes to 82 degrees Celsius nearly instantly. Then, from the 250 to 750 second mark, it climbs from 84 degrees to 90 degrees, where it eventually remains. For a system with 8 case fans, 90 degrees isn't a good result for the CPU, especially not on a 9800X3D, which is relatively moderate on power compared to systems of the past. It's borderline hard throttle territory, and will definitely see clock drops from precision boost scaling due to thermals. The CPU fans idle around 1000 RPM and then instantly shoot to 1700 RPM under load. This immediate spike, rather than any kind of gradual ramp, is acoustically noticeable and highlights an area of improvement for Cyberpower. We'd like to see more tuning of fan hysteresis to dampen the ramp-deramp of the noise. The AIO pump runs at full speed, or 3,160 RPM, throughout the entire test, which explains why the pump noise is so apparent while idle. This next chart plots the 9800X3D's average all-core frequencies as collected in Blender during a CPU-only portion of our testing. The 9800X3D in the current Cyberpower system under review ran at 5,175 MHz all-core frequency. That's 150 MHz greater than the Cyberpower pre-built from last time, but still 50 MHz short of the 5225 MHz frequency of the properly configured 9800X3D achieved in our original review of the CPU. Losing 50 MHz across all cores isn't great, particularly because that puts Cyberpower's computer below the 5200 MHz spec defined by AMD. It's not by a lot, but Cyberpower is underperforming here versus the actual advertised spec. Cyberpower improving on itself from last year is good. But going from bad to still not as advertised but less bad isn't a huge leap forward. Next up, GPU thermals, measured during the same torture workload that fully loads the system. The GPU idles around 30 degrees Celsius, then leaps to 70 degrees, where it bounces around by a few degrees until the test completes. This is more of a factor of vBIOS temperature targets than anything else, which is configured by the video card maker. That's because the GPU fan speed will follow the card's temperature target, but the result is still good on the RTX 5080. GPU memory junction starts at a warmer 40 degrees Celsius idle and stabilizes at 72 degrees under load. This is well within the memory temperature spec, and there's more than enough room here for even dust buildup, poor maintenance habits, and reduced fan speeds. There's plenty of room thermally on the GPU and the memory. The GPU fans initially step up to 30% for a few seconds when the load kicks in, before quickly ramping fans to about 55% between the 250 and 500 second marks. The GPU fans increased by 1% a couple times during the workload, but never exceeded 60%. This chart shows a full system steady state thermals during the full system workload. CPU temperature ran too high, up at 90.7 degrees Celsius. The I/O die isn't that critical, and its temperature mostly is interesting just to tell us about CPU mounting pressure distribution issues, but we're not seeing any here. GPU temperature and GPU memory junction temperature are both good overall. The CPU VDD-CR VDD VRM component result is warm, that's part of the VRM, at 81.1 degrees, but it's well within spec. One of the drive temperature readings is also on the warmer side at 63.5 degrees Celsius, but there's also still plenty of room here. Other than the CPU temperature, none of these are bad. Our next test involved putting the system in our hemi-anechoic acoustic chamber for evaluating the noise levels. This chart plots noise level over time during full system load. The system idles around 27.1 dBA and a noise floor of 15 dBA on this particular day, so the fans could be tuned to run quieter when not under any load. Under load, the system immediately spikes to 44 dBA, eventually leveling out at 45.3 dBA during steady state. The lack of a gradual ramp indicates that Cyberpower has a lot of room to improve the fan configuration so that it doesn't jam the throttle to the floor at the first sign of load, as that'll lead to rapid ramp-deramp fan cycles during load cycling, which will just sound annoying. This significant and extremely abrupt 17 or so dBA increase will definitely be noticeable by users. More importantly, and not shown by this chart, but in the next one, although 27 dBA is okay, the noise quality while idle is just plain bad. Everyone who came across this PC over the course of testing immediately asked what was making the weird noise. And it was the closed-loop liquid cooler pump making the noise. Here's a sound sample we recorded with the side panel removed to emphasize the sound from the pump. We've increased the volume coming up here, so you shouldn't focus on how loud it is, but rather on the quality of the sound. On the bright side, the instant and obnoxiously sudden fan spike to 45.3 dBA drowns out the pump chatter. We took this sound sample as the system entered load in its stock configuration. Here's a frequency spectrum plot we collected in our hemi-anechoic chamber during full load. The GML 99653 had its greatest peaks at 310 and 703 Hz frequencies. Overall, the distribution of frequencies across the curve is similar to most computers that come through the office. We also plotted frequency spectrum measured with the side panel removed, and then rotated the case 90 degrees to accentuate the pump noise during idle. We did this to better understand the noise profile of the pump. In this situation, we're seeing a spike at 200 Hz, about 750 Hz, and subsequent spikes at 1400 to 1500, 2100 to 2300, and a big one at 8800 to 9400 Hz. All of this is from the pump. The 8800 to 9400 Hz and the 4000 Hz spikes are what make it particularly annoying, as most people find higher frequencies, especially ones that start and stop, harder to ignore than lower frequencies. Power at the wall is next. We run this testing with a capture utility between the power supply and the wall, meaning we're capturing power before the power supply. This test is useful for determining if the power supply chosen by Cyberpower is sufficient for the system. Power consumption started around 104 watts while idle for the full system. Starting a full workload increased to an average of 736 watts during the full system load. This is before converting to DC and before being fed to the system, so there's more room here than shown. The spec for the power supply is more than sufficient for this build and gives some headroom for small changes. We'll move on to inspecting BIOS and the packing. Normally we would also look at the software in this section, but because we couldn't, we won't. Booting into BIOS revealed version 1087, released September 30th, 2025. The shipped BIOS version was one version out of date from when Ryan ordered his system. We typically look for the most up-to-date version at the time of purchase, but being a couple months or one version behind isn't too bad. Most of the BIOS settings were left on auto, including CPU and memory voltages. We don't have any problem with those. Cyberpower enabled Expo 1, which is at least good, and disabled ASUS Performance Enhancement, which is even better. As for areas of improvement, Cyberpower didn't enable resizable bar, which can definitely negatively impact GPU performance these days. Although unlikely in a bad case scenario, if a user were to install an Intel GPU at some point in the future, like if maybe Intel makes one that's better than a 5080 one day and you upgrade to it or something, they'd be particularly punished without enabling it. We also wished Cyberpower would disable the auto-install ASUS Utilities option and download and install ASUS Driver Hub option, which are unfortunately both enabled by default. We ran a piece previously about ASUS's major software vulnerabilities, which include Driver Hub. and Armory Crate, and they're enabling Driver Hub by default. We'd also like to see some form of customized fan curve in BIOS to better control noise, but Cyberpower left it as defaults. Let's move on to packaging and accessories. The pre-built shipped in a single box, which isn't great, but aside from minor wear on the outer box, we didn't notice any significant damage during shipping. The pre-built arrived with self-expanding foam inside the chassis supporting the GPU, which is good. Some companies skip this or improperly expand the foam, which we've seen result in damage in the past. In terms of accessories, the pre-built came with an RGB mouse and keyboard, which we consider one tier above the e-waste most system integrators include. Cyberpower also included this plastic pouch containing its quick start guide, the power supply cable, and the motherboard's wireless antenna. We wish Cyberpower had included the RTX 5080 power adapter that came with it, as well as the motherboard manual and accessories, like the additional SSD standoffs and screws that should have been included. Unfortunately, throwing out the power adapter for the 5080 serves really no purpose here, and leaves the user with one less easy option if they swap parts in the future. Most modern power supplies do run 12-volt high power natively, but since these GPUs include adapters, we think they should just be passed on to the buyer like some of these other things. The quick start guide is, although welcomed, unfortunately counterproductive. Step 1 states, quote, remove screws from left side panel and remove the panel, end quote, when in fact users don't need to remove any screws to remove the side panel. Instead, they'd actually need to remove the top panel first, which is magnetic, and that's not mentioned, and then they'd need to pry the side panel from the top edge. People would be able to figure this out, but this is poor attention to detail from Cyberpower, and the people who need this guide would probably find that lack of detail on needing to remove the top panel frustrating. Step 2 directs users to connect their display via the connectors on the GPU rather than the motherboard. This is good, and it's an accurate thing to say. Step 3 details how to connect the peripheral devices. No problems there. In Step 4, Cyberpower details how users will need to switch the power supply switch to the on position, pictured with the PSU switch located externally as normal. Although the Montech HSO1 and HSO2 cases that are used here are configured with their PSU switches internally. This could have been problematic for new users had the switch not been on when it arrived. Thankfully, however, Cyberpower did set the switch to on before shipping the system. The conclusion is really simple here. You shouldn't buy it. It didn't turn on when we booted it. So again, Ryan on the team bought it for a personal system and it didn't boot. Like straight out of the box, didn't turn on. He knows our processes. He cataloged every single detail about it as he was opening it and sort of getting it set up. So we knew start to finish what all the problems were already, and it just tripped that threshold where it was like, all right, let me just buy it from you and we'll review it instead, because this is not worth his time to go get a return and refund on and swap it for something else. So you shouldn't buy it, but even if it did boot, the next issues are that the CPU is still not hitting the advertised clocks. And just like we've talked about in the past, apparently what you do with a Cyberpower computer is you buy it and then you buy a CPU cooler. And then you install that CPU cooler instead of theirs, and then probably you're pretty taken care of. That seems to be how about all of these have gone now for something like almost 10 years of reviewing Cyberpower pre-builts at this point. So our view is always the same on this stuff, which is that these computers, they need to get out the door, and for us, it's pass-fail. There's kind of a checklist of things that need to be in a certain way, and if it fails on any one of them, then it fails, period. That's how we view it. It's the same reason that when a CPU is overheating and it's dropping clocks, we view that as a fail. Because if you're buying a pre-built, the whole fucking purpose of it is that it works and it works well when it gets to you. Because I don't personally think there's a problem with buying pre-builts. Obviously, we advocate for DIY. But there's plenty of reasons you would just buy something that is pre-configured. And one of them that we often refer to is maybe you're kind of the go-to person in your group of friends or family or whatever who recommends computer parts and things like that. And if you don't want to or don't have the time to get fully hands-on with a build for someone, then maybe they ask you for a pre-built recommendation, or if they don't want you to do it or whatever. And that's why we do these reviews, to try and find something that an enthusiast can actually recommend to a friend. Or if you do recommend a pre-built that we find, you know what problems it's probably going to have. So we've detailed those here. So the short version is we've got a few problems. It runs hot. It's not as bad as the past Cyberpower pre-builds, but it's still not hitting the advertised clocks, and that's bad. A second problem is it's loud. The pump is god-awful. It is one of the worst sounding pumps that I've ever heard come through this office. And they've got it set to loud. It's got like one volume level and it runs at that all the time. You could change it, But as soon as you start changing things in BIOS, the pre-built manufacturer has failed in their job. The other problem was the video card that wasn't properly socketed, seated in the PCIe slot, and the power cable that wasn't fully connected. And again, as soon as Ryan opened the box, he noted these two things, and that's in addition to it not turning on. So it's just there's so many problems here lined up where it's really simple, no recommendation from us. The thing is, though, we actually wanted to like this system. Cyberpower technically improved its CPU thermals from last time and reduced the extent of throttling we saw in the last one at the expense of increased noise levels. The really sad thing, though, is that if those main 3, maybe 4 problems had been resolved, this would have been the best Cyberpower PC that we've ever reviewed from them as a pre-built, because the part selection is actually mostly pretty good. The CL48 timing is not great, but RAM situations outside of their control. And also, X3D is like one of the few CPUs where you can get away with garbage tier RAM. But at $100 over DIY parts cost and the parts they selected, it all makes sense. So it's just sad to see it not come together in a way that makes sense. But that's going to be it for this one. Fun to do a pre-built review. Too bad it wasn't any good. We'll look at getting some more in. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. We buy these ourselves for the reviews. In this case, I bought it from Ryan after he bought it from Cyberpower. And if you want to support our ability to do that, then you can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.